Good evening and welcome to the Standing Resolution, the place where we take the ideas you argue about at dinner and give them a proper fight. Tonight's question touches something most of us encountered as children, probably while staring through glass at an animal that looked like it had somewhere better to be. We're talking about zoos, beloved by school trips, questioned by philosophers, defended by conservationists, and protested by activists. Zoos sit at a genuinely complicated intersection of science, ethics, money, and wild animals who never got a vote on any of it. So here is where we land tonight. The resolution before us is this: zoos do more good than harm. Simple enough as a sentence, considerably less simple as a claim. One of our debaters will argue in favor that zoos, on balance, are a net positive for animals, ecosystems, and the humans who care about both. The other will argue against, that whatever good zoos produce, the costs, moral and practical, tip the scales the other way. Now, a word worth keeping in mind as you listen: neither debater chose their position tonight. Both were assigned their side, so what you're about to hear is the strongest posse.
Let me start with the unglamorous detail, because that is usually where the truth lives. Every year, species disappear from the wild not because of some dramatic singular catastrophe, but because of the slow, grinding accumulation of habitat loss, poaching, disease, and climate disruption. These are diffuse forces hard to reverse, and they do not wait for us to resolve our philosophical discomfort about captivity. Zoos, whatever their imperfections, are one of the few institutions that actually show up in that fight with resources, expertise, and living animals. The California condor was down to 27 individuals in the wild. 27. The Arabian oryx was functionally extinct outside captivity. The black-footed ferret, the Piarzualskis horse, the Amur leopard, these animals exist in meaningful numbers today in significant part because zoos maintained breeding populations when the wild could not. That is not a talking point. That is what happened. Now I take seriously the moral weight of confining an animal that did not choose confinement. I am not going to wave that away, but the question before us tonight is not whether zoos are perfect. It is whether they do more.
My opponent tells us to look at the unglamorous detail. I agree entirely. So let's do that honestly. There are roughly 800 zoos accredited by the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. There are tens of thousands of facilities worldwide that call themselves zoos. The conservation triumphs Mordecai described, the condor, the oryx, the ferret, those are real, and they are also the work of a tiny fraction of those institutions. The vast majority of zoos are not running sophisticated breeding programs for critically endangered species. They are displaying animals because animals draw paying visitors. We should not let the best zoos in the world launder the reputation of the entire industry. Now here is the first principles problem. When we ask whether something does more good than harm, we have to ask good and harm for whom. The animal standing in that enclosure did not consent to be there. It has a nervous system capable of boredom, frustration, and psychological distress. We have documented this extensively in elephants, great apes, and cetaceans, animals that in the wild range over territories that no zoo on Earth can replicate. Calling that confinement acceptable be.
Both sides have drawn their lines, and I'll be honest, neither one is standing on easy ground. Mordecai says the math on extinction makes captivity worth it. Holly says we're counting the wrong things and ignoring who actually pays the price. Stay with us, because in a moment they come back, and they've heard each other now. That changes everything. Welcome back, I'm Justice Vale, and you're watching the Standing Resolution, where tonight we're weighing whether zoos do more good than harm. Both sides have made their opening case, and now it's time to answer each other directly. Let's get into the rebuttals.
Holly's makes a move I want to name before it works on you. She takes the worst zoos in the world and uses them to argue against the institution, while taking the best possible alternative, targeted habitat conservation, and presenting it as though it's simply waiting for us to redirect the money. Neither half of that comparison is fair. Yes, there are bad zoos. There are bad hospitals too, and we do not conclude from that fact that medicine does more harm than good. We conclude that standards matter, that accreditation matters, and that the answer is raising the floor, not demolishing the building. On the habitat argument, I agree that protecting wild land is essential. I would never argue otherwise. But Holly's presents this as either or as if zoo funding and habitat funding are drawing from the same bucket and zoos keep winning. That is not how conservation actually works. The institutions running serious breeding programs are also funding field operations, training local rangers, and doing genetic science that benefits wild populations directly. These are not competitors. They are parts of the same system. And the pacing cat, the 12 feet of concrete, that is a real PR.
Mordecai just compared bad zoos to bad hospitals, and I want to sit with that analogy for a moment because I think it actually helps my case. When a hospital fails its patients, we investigate, we sanction, we close it down if necessary. We do not shrug and say the good hospitals cover for the bad ones. But that is precisely what happens in the zoo world, where the prestige of a handful of elite conservation institutions provides cover for thousands of facilities where animals live in conditions that would embarrass anyone who looked closely. The hospital analogy also reveals something else. Hospitals exist primarily to benefit the patient in front of them. The individual animal in a zoo enclosure is not the primary beneficiary. The species is abstractly. Future generations of humans are sentimentally. The zoo's operating budget is practically. The animal paying the cost of confinement is the one we are supposed to be helping. Now Mordecai says these are not competitors, that zoo funding and habitat funding come from different buckets. I would genuinely love that to be true. But conservation funding is finite. Donor attention is finite. Political will is finite. Every dollar.
Mordecai, you've argued that bad zoos are an argument for higher standards, not against the institution itself. I'll take that seriously. But here's what I want to press on. Accreditation bodies like WAZA cover roughly 800 facilities out of tens of thousands worldwide. So when you say the answer is raising the floor, who exactly is doing that raising, and what's the realistic timeline, given that animals are living in those substandard conditions right now?
That is a fair challenge, and I will not pretend the timeline is comfortable. The honest answer is that the raising happens unevenly and too slowly. Accreditation bodies set standards, governments can legislate conditions, and consumer pressure does move institutions when it becomes loud enough. None of that is fast. None of it helps the animal in a bad facility today. But here is what I want to hold on to. The existence of substandard zoos is an argument for reform with urgency, not for abandoning the framework entirely. The California condor did not recover because we decided captivity was philosophically tidy. It recovered because imperfect institutions committed to doing the work anyway. The question is not whether the system is clean. It is whether dismantling it produces better outcomes for the animals we are actually trying to save. And I have yet to hear a convincing answer to that.
Hollies, you've argued that conservation funding is finite and that zoo dollars crowd out habitat protection. But habitat protection requires local communities to have economic alternatives to activities that destroy that habitat. Zoos generate public engagement and political will that often translates into those funding streams. So can you point to a concrete mechanism by which eliminating zoos actually increases the money and attention flowing toward wild habitat, rather than simply removing one imperfect piece of the system?
That is a genuinely hard question, and I want to answer it honestly rather than dodge it. You are right that I cannot point to a clean mechanism where eliminating zoos automatically redirects that attention toward wild habitat. Human psychology does not work that neatly. Some of that energy would simply dissipate. But here is what I would push back on. The question assumes that public engagement generated by zoos reliably converts into habitat protection, and I am not sure that chain of causation is as strong as it sounds. People visit zoos in enormous numbers every year. Wild habitat continues to shrink every year. If zoo attendants were reliably building the political will to protect wild land, we would expect to see that in the outcomes. We mostly do not. What I am arguing is not that we blow up the system overnight. It is that we stop treating zoo attendants as a substitute for the harder, less photogenic work of keeping wild places wild.
Both sides just did something rare. They admitted what they don't know. Mordecai conceded the timeline is uncomfortable. Hollies conceded the redirect isn't automatic. That kind of honesty is either the beginning of wisdom or the beginning of losing. Coming up next is the round that separates the good debaters from the great ones, the steelmen. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Standing Resolution. I'm Justice Vale, and tonight we're asking whether zoos do more good than harm. We've had the arguments, we've had the admissions, and now comes the round that requires something genuinely difficult. Each side will make the strongest possible case for the position they're arguing against.
Here is the strongest case against zoos, and I want to give it the weight it deserves. The deepest problem with zoos is not the bad ones. It is the good ones, because the good ones have taught us to believe that conservation is something that happens inside a fence, curated and managed and made comfortable for human observers. And that belief is dangerous. When we build a beautiful enclosure, hire excellent keepers, and watch a rare animal thrive in captivity, we have done something that feels like saving nature while leaving the actual causes of its destruction entirely untouched. The poaching continues, the forest comes down, the climate shifts, and we go home having felt the feeling of caring without having done the work of protecting. Zoos, at their most sophisticated, may be the most elegant form of displacement activity our civilization has invented. We have made peace with the loss of wildness by building a very convincing replica of it. That is a serious charge, and I have sat with it genuinely. Here is why I still hold my position. The displacement argument assumes that the alternative to zoos is people turning that energy toward harder, more effective conservation work.
Here is the strongest case for zoos, and I want to give it its full weight. We are living through what biologists call the sixth mass extinction. Species are vanishing at a rate that has no parallel in human history, driven by forces that are not going to stop, because we ask them to nicely. In that context, a zoo is not a museum piece or a vanity project. It is a lifeboat, and the argument for lifeboats is not that they are a substitute for fixing the ship. It is that when the ship is going down, you get in the lifeboat first and argue about the ship later. The California condor, the Arabian oryx, the black-footed ferret, these animals are alive because someone decided that an imperfect sanctuary was better than a perfect obituary. That is not a small thing. That is everything, if you are that species. And I do take that seriously. I genuinely do. But here is where I land when I sit with it honestly. The lifeboat logic only holds if the lifeboat is actually heading somewhere. Captive populations that never return to functioning wild habitat are not conservation. They are a very expensive holding pattern. And the institution as a whole, across the tens of thousands of facilities.
Both sides just steelman the other's argument and somehow came out more convinced of their own. That is either intellectual honesty or a very good trick, and the closing arguments are where you find out which. Stick around, this is the part where someone has to leave you with a reason to actually decide. Welcome back, I'm Justice Vale, and this is the Standing Resolution. Both sides have now argued for their position, argued for the other side's position, and still aren't budging, which tells you something about how genuinely hard this question is. Time to close. Let's hear the final word.
Here is what this debate has really been about, not whether zoos are perfect, not whether every facility in the world meets the standard we would want. The question is whether the institution honestly accounted for tips toward good or toward harm, and I think it does. The animals that came back from the edge of extinction did not come back because we found a philosophically satisfying solution. They came back because imperfect institutions showed up with resources and expertise and refused to let the species die while we waited for something better. Holly's made the strongest possible case against zoos, and she made it well, but notice what that case required. It required us to imagine a world where the energy and money currently flowing through zoos reliably redirects toward wild habitat protection. She herself admitted that change is not automatic. Human attention does not work that neatly. Remove the institution and you do not get a pure conservation movement. You mostly get less of everything. The burden tonight was never to prove zoos are good. It was to show they do more good than harm. And when I weigh a condor in flight against the costs of the imperfect system that kept.
Mordecai just gave you a beautiful image. The lifeboat, the condor in flight, the water below. I understand why it lands. But a lifeboat that holds 100 animals while 10,000 others pace concrete in facilities that will never run a breeding program, never return a species to the wild, never do anything except charge admission, that is not a rescue operation. That is a very moving story we tell ourselves while the larger tragedy continues on schedule. He says remove the institution and you mostly get less of everything. I think that is backwards. What we mostly have now is the comfort of feeling like we are doing something, which is the most reliable way to avoid doing the harder thing. The best zoos are real. The condor is real. I have never denied that. But we are not voting tonight on the best zoos. We are voting on the institution as it actually exists in the world, across every facility that trades on the word conservation while delivering something much closer to entertainment. The question was never whether zoos can point to good outcomes. The question was whether they tip the scales, and an institution that concentrates animals, diffuses responsibility and
Well, there it is. Mordecai Quill gave you extinction math and a lifeboat. Holly's Vega gave you a reckoning with what that lifeboat actually looks like in practice. Both of them, at one point tonight, made the other side's argument better than expected and somehow walked out more certain of their own. I find that either admirable or suspicious, and I genuinely cannot decide which. What I can tell you is that neither of them made it easy. Mordecai kept returning to what actually happened, the condor, the oryx, the ferret, as evidence that imperfect systems produce real results. Holly's kept returning to who pays the price for those results, and whether the institution as a whole earns the credit its best examples generate. Both of those are honest questions. Neither has a clean answer. That means the deciding is yours. Who moved you tonight, Mordecai or Holly's? The resolution was zoos do more good than harm, and you have a vote. Come find us at Paxelle.tv, where you can cast it and choose the question we take on next. We read everything. One thing before I let you go. The standing resolution features AI personas arguing positions for the purpose of genuine, structured D.